So this is my evidence for domain 1 on the Danielson rubric for my 2017-2018 portfolio. Component 1B is demonstrating the knowledge of students, and I used a couple of things to gather information from my students. First of all, I gave them a really extensive introduction survey. This was, partly really practical to find out, what do you prefer to be called. It was partly to get feedback on summer work, but I also wanted to get a little bit of information about them as learners. And I understood that this was like self-reported, but it was really good information for me to have um, at the beginning of the year. I wanted to know how confident they were. I wanted to know how they typically find English class and what they find challenging. And I really wanted them to start to think about their philosophy on learning and on grades, because I thought, that's something that um, I, as their teacher, need to know to kind of figure out, who I can interact with in what ways. And it also helps me to kind of see what sort of maybe possibly unhealthy attitudes that we're going to have to be combating and figuring out how pervasive they are as the year goes by. I also asked them to think a little bit about cheating and their desires to take shortcuts. So I hoped that in addition to giving me information, it would start to get these kids thinking a little bit um, about themselves. And then I have all of that information over here, populated their responses into a Google form. And I could actually sort of, if I wanted to see their responses to a particular question, I could, hide these columns, and then I can really easily see okay, Claire said this about this question, or whatever. The other thing I use to gather information about my AP students in particular is I use PVAS data um, to see sort of their projections in terms of how likely they are for success on this test. And this information over here is kind of extraneous. I just added that yesterday. But this kind of, I have it sorted top to bottom at the moment. So I could kind of see where my students are in terms of, okay, which ones I'm pretty confident in what they're doing, which ones, might struggle a little bit. I actually kept notes of what their 10th grade teachers had said about whether or not they should even take the course. And this really helped me to get to know them as a group and as individuals at the beginning of the year. And then I could actually use that information to do different things. I could use that information to make predictions in September about where, based on that information, along with some pretest data, where they might be falling and what challenges they might be up against as they move through the course. It also helps me when I get to our mock exams. I can kind of calculate based on, okay, here's how they did on our practice multiple choice, and here's how they did on our practice essays. The score calculator says they'll probably earn this. Does that kind of align with what the PVAS data was saying? So I use that for knowledge of my students. Domain 1F is about designing coherent instruction, and I think the best example of this is our education unit, which was obviously part of my building goal, part of just about everything that I focused on this year. But I think this is a really good example of good instruction, and also very well organized and planned and put together. As you can see from my doc, this was their assignment sheet, and it was given to them electronically, and everything was linked right from here, including supplementary information, screencasts, talking about instructions for working at their own pace, as well as, all the way through the reflection process and a checklist. This was a really cool assignment. It was very authentic. Students' task was to write a letter to a stakeholder addressing a problem in the education world that they wanted to speak out about. It was very student directed. I didn't tell them anything about how long it needed to be or what needed to be included, other than the fact that they had to use 2 sources. They worked at their own pace. They developed their plan. They did their learning through the textbook and the screencasts. We conferenced. I did, hundreds of conferences over the course of a couple of weeks. They did peer review. It was very, very student self-directed and engaging. And it also was cool because it allowed for some differentiation. It allowed me to really see who needed what and how to help them through the conferencing process. And then finally, Domain 1F is about designing student assessments. And I thought the assessment process for this writing workshop actually worked really well too. First thing I did was I had them self annotate for the skills. Like, okay, these are the skills that we're going to be looking at. These are the skills that are on the rubric. Mark in your papers where you've done them, because I wanted them to make sure that they knew very intentionally what they had done and why they had done it. And then, as kind of a follow up to that, their rubric was really specific. And I did sort of a 3-column rubric for effective, adequate, and inadequate. And for each of the skills, which runs across, they had a lot of descriptors, and students were able to say, maybe get effective over here and adequate over here. And this made it easy for me to, like, I could just highlight the different lines on the rubric to sort of see where they fell. But in addition to this, which I thought was really probably the most detailed rubric I've ever made, I also had them self-assess. I gave them this and said, okay, where do you fall on this? And that in itself, they probably, they're all going to say they're wonderful. So I gave them these self-evaluation examples. I said, okay, so here's an example of an inadequate application. Here's an adequate one. Here's an effective one. And then I gave an explanation like, okay, this is effective because of these reasons. This is effective because of these reasons. And these descriptors down here are the very same ones that go over to the rubric. And I did find that, I looked at the student self-assessment as I was reading them, and, some students were, of course, better than others at accurately identifying where they were at. Of course, they're kids, and they will want to, see themselves for what they want to be, maybe rather than what they are. But there were some cases where, a student on their rubric was able to, through their explanation on their self-assessment rubric, were able to explain, like, okay, I think this is adequate because blah, 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 blah. And I might not have initially seen it that way. So the self-evaluation with the examples and the self-rubric were kind of a cool assessment tool that I tried for the first time this year.